When we stop performing goodness and start standing in goodness as already given, then that convergence of wholeness and desire and goodness do not remain within. They naturally move outwards into what it is to belong. Connection is the internal experience of identity and direction and movement all aligning together within me. And because that is so life-giving, because it is about thriving, it can't stay contained just within me. It overflows and naturally then shapes how I show up in relationships with others and with God. As I am remembering who I am, as I am learning to trust the direction of where that leads me and to ground myself in alignment with the river of goodness, then connection means I bring all of those things, a fully whole self, to you. That me comes to you to experience we in connection. When we are no longer performing goodness, standing on the bank of the river, but we have courageously chosen to enter into the river, then connection is no longer about what is required of me to change, but rather I bring the fullness of myself into relationship with you, and therefore relational harmony is completely different. It is no longer about connection feeling like, what do I have to do to keep the peace? Who do I have to become? Who do I have to perform? Instead, it is a created peace. What we call relational harmony, keeping the peace, I just want peace, is a bit of a misunderstanding about what peace really is, because there is a difference between the absence of conflict and the presence of connection, of harmony, of community, of justice, of rightness. One is passively created by diminishing yourself, and the other is the true sense of relational harmony, which again, remember, goodness is about us living in harmony with who we've been created to be. A fish swimming and a bird flying and a plant growing, those are evidences of goodness. When that is brought into relationship, then it's about what goodness is for me, meeting goodness is for you, and neither one of those things demanding one to be reduced. So that requires an active presence of my whole self coming toward you and meeting you, hopefully with your whole self, even in the growingness of that, so that what connection looks like does not require anyone to be made small. And it's really interesting because connection being the fourth principle in the framework of whole story living is that it is truly the convergence of all of the principles in one. Because without wholeness, following desire to the river of goodness, and that converging in connection with who I am, we're back to wholeness. And so wholeness is both the starting point and the ending point within me. And that creates a connectedness within me that then extends out to others in a way that I bring my whole self to your whole self, and no one is required to become anything other than whole in order for relationship to exist. Now, when belonging feels conditional, when connection requires us to shrink or to manage or to even disappear, over time, our nervous system starts to call a retreat. And over time, we start to disconnect from ourselves and from others a little bit more at a time. It's kind of fascinating because in my own story, this disconnection looked like connection on the outside. I didn't retreat into my bedroom and never leave. I was showing up for my relationships. I was showing up for my job. I was doing my job. I was doing relationships. But what had happened was I was no longer there. I was showing up, but there was nothing there. That belonging in that space required what felt like me to be there and not be there, to watch myself live out these relationships and responsibilities, but in a way where I was not bringing any part of myself to the equation. I had left wholeness back a long time ago. There was no movement and no river. Even though from the outside, it really does feel or seem like we're still showing up. But there's no access to goodness, meaning there's no access to that harmony and that beauty and that creativity and that mutuality of me and the river brought into the shared space of connection. Sometimes it means that we can go a really long time and seem okay until we're not. And when we finally realize we're not, the exhaustion is extreme. This is different than the fight or flight response called flop, where situationally we just kind of collapse. This is the long-term result of nervous system overload, where finally everything around us crumbles and we think that we've done something wrong. Our strategies are no longer working, which is exactly the point, because at that moment, when everything finally collapses away, it's often the only time when we give ourselves permission to consider doing something different. And in that space where nothing, where I feel like I have access to nothing, the return to connection begins with that moment of wholeness. Can I remember just a tiny bit of who I am beneath who I've always been? Beneath the me that I thought I had to be, which makes space for what do I want? What speaks life to me? Which brings us to the river and the grounding reality of the gift of goodness, which then converges into reconnection with me and what it is to show up in shared space without letting go of that. That feels so good. And yet, for many of us, that has not been our experience in relationships, and we think that we've done something wrong. But the reality is that not every relationship is life-giving. Not every relationship is built on goodness. Not every relationship is built on two people coming together in wholeness or in the movement of true desire. And so connection is the courage to bring presence into that reality and to engage what it means to start showing up differently. And what does that ask of me? For remembering wholeness, following desire back home to goodness means that I bring all of that with me to what is healthy, true, real connection, which means a lot of what I do in connection needs to be washed away in that river. That will require relationships to look differently, yes. And that asks something very, very challenging of us to notice and name where are the relationships where I do not show up as myself, and what does that mean? Now, sometimes these are relationships that we are required in many ways to be part of. And some of those relationships we can release. But in all of our relationships, what we must remember is that when wholeness comes to desire, comes to goodness, comes to connection, is that we always have a choice. We always have a choice. And the moment that choice is taken away, we are no longer functioning in whole story living. We are back in our protective self that tells us we don't have a choice. But in the core of who we are, part of our very goodness is that we always have a choice. We were given a choice from the foundation of the world. So that when we bring ourselves to the relationships, even with God, maybe and especially with God, and we bring ourselves to these relationships, what does it mean to come from a place of wholeness, and what is life-giving and what is goodness, and look around at what I choose. There is nothing that whole story living asks of us that is for our survival. Whole story living is about inviting us to questions that bring us to thriving. And it's not easy. There is no circumstance under which we have done what we've done for a long time based on very deep pain where this is an easy choice. If that is what your experience is, can you call me? Because I've never seen it and I'd like to study your brain for science. It is hard. But in the words of one of my favorite movies, Tom Hanks to Gina Davis in A League of Their Own, it's supposed to be hard because it's the hard that makes it great. The lessons that we remember are the ones that we had to work hard for. We all yearn for the miracle and we forget them. But what does it mean to wrestle with what does this wholeness-based identity ask of me when I bring that identity to connection, to belonging, to relationships, where the anxiety in us was formed in the first place? Many, many teachers and scientists tell you that we were harmed in relationships and the culmination of our healing is in relationships. I believe that. The challenge is that we tend to try to find our healing in the relationships that are still harming us. That cannot be. If you are experiencing a continual belittling or shaming or blaming, if you are experiencing any kind of abuse, any kind of no, I won't do that, I don't care if it hurts you, then you are not in a relational space where that healing will come. What does whole story living ask? Well, what is it to remember who I am? To learn to trust the movement of that identity towards the reclaiming of goodness as my inheritance. And what does that mean, both in the wholeness of myself and the wholeness of me brought to you? The answers to those questions are as unique as you are. But at the end, there is one answer that defines all of the answers that you would come up with. And that is true connection creates, nurtures, and sustains peace. And peace is a verb. Peace is an action word. Peace is not nobody's fighting. Peace is the presence of justice and fairness and goodness and wholeness and desire for everyone. And if the answers that you come up with are not moving the direction toward building that kind of peace, then maybe we go back to the drawing board. Because at the end of the day, connection built on the principles of whole story living converging together builds a house of peace that stands. And that house requires tending, maintenance. Somebody's got to check the roof. It doesn't happen by accident. It happens intentionally with small choices over time. And at the end of the day, that peace always requires us to choose. What is the choice that returns you home to that relational connection and belonging that lives in peace? That is the return to connection. And when that happens, we find ourselves once again in wholeness, and the framework is complete.